When desperate widow Jacob Brennan married runaway slave Violet Hayes in 1867, it was supposed to be a business arrangement, her freedom for his farm's survival. But as bounty hunters close in and their fake marriage becomes devastatingly real, Jacob discovers that the woman he wed to save his land might just be the one to save his broken heart. Will their love be strong enough to survive when her dangerous past finally catches up with them? Jacob Brennan's axe bit deep into the frozen wood, each swing echoing across the empty Dakota territory like a gunshot in the November morning of 1867. Sweat froze on his forehead despite the bitter cold, but he kept chopping, trying to silence the voice in his head that whispered about the bank notice crumpled in his coat pocket. 3 months. That's all the time he had left before they took his father's farm. The cottonwood finally crashed down, its bare branches scratching against the hard ground like skeleton fingers. Jacob wiped his face with a torn sleeve and squinted across the rolling grassland that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Once, this land had been green and full of promise. Now it looked as dead as everything else in his life. "Mister, you got any work?" Jacob spun around, his hand moving toward the rifle leaning against a nearby stump. A young black woman stood at the edge of his property, her simple brown dress dusty from walking and her dark eyes holding a mixture of hope and fear that made his chest tighten. She couldn't have been more than 20, with braided hair tucked under a faded blue headscarf and hands that looked like they knew hard work. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. They reminded him of his son David's eyes, full of stubborn determination that refused to break no matter what the world threw at them. "Work!" Jacob lowered his hand from the rifle but didn't step closer. "What kind of work you looking for? Cleaning? Cooking? Mending clothes?" Her voice was soft but steady. "I can milk cows, feed chickens, anything you need doing. I don't eat much, and I can sleep in the barn if you got one." Jacob studied her face, noting the hollow cheeks that spoke of too many missed meals and the way she held herself, proud despite her desperation. "What's your name?" "Violet Hayes." She lifted her chin a little higher. "I walked here from Cedar Falls. Heard you might need help with your place." "Who told you that?" Violet's fingers worried the edge of her worn shawl. "Folk in town said you lost your boy to fever couple winters back. Said your wife died birthing him. Figured maybe you could use someone to keep house." The mention of David and Catherine hit Jacob like a physical blow. He turned away, pretending to examine his fallen tree while he fought to control his breathing. Nobody talked about his family anymore. Most folks had the decency to let sleeping ghosts lie. "I can't pay much," he said finally, his voice rougher than he intended. "Don't need much." Violet took a small step forward. "Just a place to stay and maybe some food. I work hard, Mr. Brennan. Won't give you any trouble." Jacob looked back at her, really looked this time. There was something familiar in her desperate hope, something that reminded him not just of David but of himself. Someone fighting to survive when the whole world seemed determined to grind them into dust. The first snowflakes began to fall, fat and lazy, dusting Violet's shoulders and the dead grass around her feet. Winter was coming whether they were ready or not. "You running from something?" Jacob asked. Violet's eyes flickered, just for a moment, but it was enough to confirm his suspicion. "Aren't we all running from something? Some things chase harder than others." "Yes, sir, they do." Violet met his gaze directly. "But I ain't done nothing wrong. Just trying to make a life for myself like anybody else." Jacob believed her, which surprised him. He'd learned not to trust easily after the war, after losing everything that mattered. But standing there in the falling snow, looking at this woman who'd walked miles just for the chance to work, he found himself nodding. "There's a small room off the kitchen," he said. "Nothing fancy, but it's warm and dry. You can stay there." He paused, studying her face. "But I got rules. You pull your weight, keep your business to yourself, and if trouble comes looking for you, you tell me straight." Relief flooded Violet's features, making her look younger and more vulnerable. "Thank you, Mr. Brennan. You won't regret this. Call me Jacob." He shouldered his axe and started walking toward the house. "And Miss Hayes? I regret most everything these days. But maybe we can help each other not regret this." As they walked through the swirling snow toward the small wooden cabin that had been too quiet for too long, Jacob felt something shift inside his chest. Not hope exactly, but maybe the possibility of hope. The woman beside him walked with the grace of someone who'd learned to carry heavy burdens without complaint. Neither of them could have guessed that in 3 months, when the bank came calling, Jacob would make a desperate proposal that would change both their lives forever. Neither could have imagined that the arrangement born of necessity would become something neither expected nor planned for. But first, they had to survive the winter. "Marry me." The coffee cup slipped from Violet's fingers, hitting the rough wooden table with a sharp crack that echoed through the small kitchen like breaking ice. Steam rose from the spilled liquid, creating ghostly patterns in the February morning light that filtered through frost-covered windows. Jacob sat across from her, his weathered hands flat against the scarred tabletop, his blue eyes serious in a way that made her stomach flutter with something between fear and anticipation. "I beg your pardon?" Violet's voice came out as barely a whisper. Outside, the wind howled through the eaves of the cabin, rattling the shutters and sending snow spiraling past the windows. They'd been snowed in for 3 days, and the forced closeness had created an odd intimacy between them. Not romantic exactly, but the kind of understanding that came from sharing space and chores and the comfortable silence of two people who'd learned to work together. "The bank's coming next week," Jacob said, his voice steady but his knuckles white where they pressed against the wood. "I got a letter yesterday when I went for supplies. They want their money, and I don't have it." Violet reached for a dish rag and began sopping up the spilled coffee, her movements careful and precise. "I'm sorry, Jacob. I know how much this place means to you. Thing is, they might be willing to work with a married man. Someone with a family to support." Jacob's eyes never left her face. Someone stable and settled, not just a broken-down widower who can't make his payments. The dish rag stilled in Violet's hands. "You want me to pretend to be your wife?" "Not pretend." Jacob leaned forward slightly. "Legal marriage. Papers signed and witnessed. But it wouldn't be real. You'd have your own room, your own space. Just a business arrangement that helps us both." Violet set down the rag and studied his face, looking for signs of jest or cruelty or the kind of desperate hunger she'd learned to fear in men. But Jacob's expression held only honest desperation and something that might have been respect. "What makes you think I need help?" she asked carefully. "Because you're here." Jacob's voice was gentle but frank. "Young woman like you, smart and capable, doesn't end up alone on a failing farm in the middle of nowhere unless she's running from something serious." Violet's throat tightened. In the 4 months she'd been working for Jacob, she'd told him almost nothing about her past. Not about Mary. Not about the white family in St. Louis. Not about the desperate choice she'd made that had forced her to flee north with nothing but the clothes on her back. "I can't give you love," Jacob continued, his voice barely audible above the wind. "Lost that part of myself when Catherine and David died. But I can give you protection. A name that means something in this territory. And when spring comes, when the farm is secure, you can leave with money in your pocket and papers that prove you're free. And if I say no?" Jacob's jaw tightened. "Then you'll freeze to death in some ditch between here and the next town. Assuming you even make it that far." The harsh truth sat between them like a physical presence. "Winter's not finished with us yet, Violet. And I don't think whatever you're running from is either." Violet's hands trembled as she folded the dish rag into neat squares. Through the window, she could see the barn where Jacob's horse stood in his stall, warm and fed and protected. Safety was such a rare thing in her world that when it appeared, she'd learned to grab it with both hands. "I have conditions," she said finally. "Name them." "I keep my own name alongside yours. I work the farm as a partner, not a servant." She met his eyes directly, her voice growing stronger. "And if we're going to do this thing, you tell me what you're really running from too." Jacob's eyebrows rose slightly. "What makes you think I'm running from anything? A man doesn't bury himself on a failing farm in the middle of nowhere unless he's trying to forget something." Violet leaned back in her chair, studying his face. "I've seen that look before, Jacob. It's the same one I see in my mirror every morning." For a long moment, the only sound was the wind and the soft crackle of the fire in the kitchen stove. Then Jacob nodded slowly, Deal, he said, extending his rough hand across the table. Partners. When Violet's smaller hand met his, the contact sent an unexpected warmth up her arm. His palm was calloused from farm work but gentle, and for just a moment she allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to be truly safe, truly protected, truly wanted. When? She asked. Soon as the weather breaks enough to get to town. Jacob's thumb brushed across her knuckles before he released her hand. Preacher Morrison will marry us if I ask him to. And after? When people start asking questions. Jacob stood and walked to the window, staring out at the endless white landscape. Let them ask. Far as anyone needs to know. We fell in love working together through the winter. He turned back to her, something almost like a smile touching the corners of his mouth. Stranger things have happened. Violet thought about the wooden horse Jacob had carved for his dead son, how she'd found him holding it by the fire one night when he thought she was asleep. She thought about the way he'd gently doctored a cut on her hand when she'd sliced herself peeling potatoes, his touch careful and kind. She thought about how he'd never once looked at her with anything but respect, never once made her feel like anything less than a person deserving of dignity. Maybe it was a business arrangement, but it was built on something real, mutual respect, shared loss, and the simple human need to not face the world alone. All right, she said. Let's get married. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the warm kitchen, two lonely souls had just made a pact that would change everything they thought they knew about love, survival, and the weight of mercy. The church bell's bronze voice cut through the crisp March air like a blade, announcing to all of Cedar Falls that Jacob Brennan was about to marry a woman most folks had never seen before. Violet stood in the tiny back room of the wooden church, her hands shaking as she tried to fasten the pearl buttons on her only good dress. A simple blue cotton she'd sewn herself during the long winter nights. You sure about this, child? Mrs. Patterson whispered, her wrinkled fingers helping with the stubborn buttons. The old woman had insisted on witnessing the ceremony, claiming it wasn't proper for a bride to stand alone at the altar. Violet caught her reflection in the small mirror propped against the wall. Dark skin, worried eyes, braided hair crowned with a ribbon that had seen better days. She looked like what she was, a runaway with nothing to offer except hard work and a heart full of secrets. No, she answered honestly, but I'm doing it anyway. Through the thin walls, she could hear the murmur of voices in the main church. Not many people. Jacob had few friends left after years of grief had made him push everyone away. But enough to make this real, to make it legal, to make it binding. He's a good man, Mrs. Patterson said softly. Lost his way after Catherine and little David passed, but his heart's still sound. You'll be safe with him. Safe. The word tasted strange in Violet's mouth. She'd almost forgotten what safety felt like. The luxury of sleeping without listening for footsteps, of working without watching the horizon for riders, of speaking without measuring every word for danger. Mrs. Patterson? Violet turned from the mirror. What if someone comes looking for me? What if I bring trouble to his door? The older woman's eyes grew sharp. What kind of trouble, child? Before Violet could answer, the church door creaked open and Reverend Morrison's voice called out, Ladies, we're ready when you are. Violet's stomach clenched like a fist. This was it, the moment that would either save her life or destroy Jacob's. She smoothed her skirt one last time and stepped into the main church. Jacob stood at the altar in his best shirt and cleanest pants, his blonde hair slicked back and his face serious as stone. When he saw her walking down the short aisle, something flickered in his blue eyes. Surprise, maybe, or appreciation. For a moment, Violet almost believed this was real, that she was a real bride walking toward a real future instead of a desperate woman grasping at salvation. Dearly beloved, Reverend Morrison began, his voice echoing in the small space. We are gathered here today to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. The words washed over Violet like water. She found herself studying Jacob's hands, strong and calloused, marked with small scars from farm work and winter chores. These were hands that built things, fixed things, protected things. When the time came to speak her vows, her voice was steady. I, Violet Hayes, take you, Jacob Brennan, to be my husband. I, Jacob Brennan, take you, Violet Hayes, to be my wife. No rings to exchange. They couldn't afford such luxuries. Instead, Jacob took her hands in his and spoke the traditional words with quiet conviction. When Reverend Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, Jacob's kiss was brief and gentle, more like a seal on a contract than a declaration of love. But walking out of that church as Mrs. Violet Brennan, Violet felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. The wedding celebration was small and simple. Mrs. Patterson had made a cake with precious sugar she'd been saving, and old Henrik Johansson produced a bottle of whiskey that made Jacob's eyes water and Violet cough when she sipped it. The handful of neighbors who'd come offered their congratulations with genuine warmth, though Violet caught some of them staring when they thought she wasn't looking. "They're curious," Jacob murmured as they walked home in the fading afternoon light. "Not used to seeing mixed marriages out here." "Are you worried about what they'll think?" Violet asked. Jacob was quiet for a long moment, his boots crunching on the last patches of snow. "I'm worried about keeping you safe," he said finally. "Everything else is just noise." That night, they sat by the fire like they had all winter, but everything felt different now. The space between them seemed both larger and smaller. They were legally bound but emotionally distant, sharing a name but not a bed, married but still strangers in many ways. "Jacob." Violet set down her mending and looked at him across the flickering firelight. "Why did you really ask me to marry you?" He looked up from the piece of wood he was carving, a habit that seemed to calm his restless hands. "I told you. The bank." "No." Violet shook her head. "There had to be other ways. You could have sold the farm, moved to town, found work with someone else. Why this? Why me?" Jacob's knife stilled against the wood. For a moment, Violet thought he wouldn't answer. Then he set down his carving and met her eyes directly. "Because you're the first person in 2 years who didn't look at me like I was broken," he said quietly. "And because when you talked about the little girl you lost, I heard something in your voice that I recognized. Something that told me you understand what it means to love someone so much that losing them nearly kills you." Violet's throat tightened. "Mary wasn't my daughter by blood." "Doesn't matter." Jacob's voice was firm. "Love doesn't care about blood. I learned that when I held David for the first time. This tiny person who was half Catherine and half me but completely himself. Love is choice, Violet. It's choosing to protect someone even when it costs you everything. Is that what you're doing now? Protecting me?" Jacob picked up his carving again, but his hands were less steady now. "Maybe. Or maybe you're protecting me from becoming the kind of man who gives up when things get hard." Outside, an owl called through the darkness, its voice lonely and wild. Violet thought about the years she'd spent caring for Mary, the desperate flight north when the fever took hold, the months of running and hiding and sleeping in barns. Now she had a roof over her head, a name that meant something, and a man who spoke of protection like it was a sacred duty. "Jacob?" she said softly. "Yes. Thank you. For today. For this chance. For—" she gestured around the warm cabin. "For letting me stop running, even if it's just for a little while." Jacob's smile was small but genuine. "Thank you for giving me a reason to fight for this place instead of just letting it die." They sat in comfortable silence after that, the fire crackling between them and the night settling around their small sanctuary. Neither spoke of the future or what would happen when spring came in earnest. Neither mentioned the shadows in their past or the dangers that might still be hunting them. For now, it was enough to be warm, to be safe, to be two people who had chosen to face the world together instead of alone. But in the distance, thunder rumbled across the prairie, and Violet couldn't shake the feeling that their peaceful winter was about to end. "Someone's coming." Jacob's voice cut through the morning stillness like a knife, sending ice through Violet's veins as she looked up from the vegetable garden where she'd been planting seeds for their first spring as husband and wife. 3 riders approached from the east, their horses kicking up dust clouds that hung in the still air like smoke signals of trouble. Violet's hands, still dirty from the rich soil, began to tremble. She'd been expecting this moment for weeks, ever since the snow melted enough for travel. The peaceful months of winter had felt like borrowed time, and now the bill was coming due. "Get in the house," Jacob said, his voice calm but urgent as he reached for the rifle leaning against the fence post. Now! But Violet was already moving, her body responding to months of practiced fear. She'd learned long ago that running was sometimes the only choice that mattered. Through the kitchen window, she watched Jacob walk slowly toward the approaching riders, his weapon held low but ready. The leader was a tall man with silver hair and expensive clothes that marked him as someone with money and power. Beside him rode a younger man with cold eyes and a badge that caught the morning sunlight. The third rider made Violet's blood turn to ice. A black man in chains, his face swollen with fresh bruises. She knew that face. Samuel, who'd worked in the same household where she'd cared for Mary. Samuel, who'd tried to help her when the fever came. Samuel, who'd been caught. Morning, the silver-haired man called out as they reined in their horses 20 feet from where Jacob stood. I'm looking for a runaway. Young black woman. Goes by the name Violet Hayes. Don't know anyone by that name, Jacob replied, his voice steady. This is private property. You'll need to move along. The man with the badge, a slave catcher, Violet realized with growing horror, nudged his horse forward. We have reliable information that she's been seen in this area. Pretty thing, about 20 years old. Might be calling herself something else now. I said I don't know anyone like that. Jacob's grip tightened on his rifle. And I said you need to leave. The silver-haired man smiled, but it held no warmth. I'm Charles Waverly, and this woman stole valuable property from my plantation before she ran. That property included money and... His eyes flicked toward the house. A child. Violet's knees nearly buckled. Mary. They were talking about Mary, the little girl she'd loved as her own daughter. The child she'd tried desperately to save when fever threatened to take her young life. Even if I knew this woman, Jacob said carefully, slavery's been illegal for 2 years now. The war settled that. The war settled a lot of things, Waverly agreed. But theft is still theft, and kidnapping is still kidnapping. This woman took my property and fled north. I want her back, and I want compensation for my losses. What property? Jacob's voice had gone dangerous quiet. Waverly's smile widened. $40 in cash and a slave child worth considerably more. The child died of fever 6 months ago, which makes this woman responsible for murder as well as theft. The word murder hit Violet like a physical blow. Mary was dead. The little girl she'd risked everything to save. The child she'd sung to and held and loved with every fiber of her being, was gone. And these men were calling her love a crime. You're on my land making serious accusations, Jacob said. I'll ask you one more time to leave. The slave catcher's hand moved toward his gun. We don't need your permission, farmer. We have legal authority to search for fugitives. Legal authority from where? The Confederate States that don't exist anymore. Jacob raised his rifle slightly. You're in Dakota territory now. Federal law applies here. Federal law that recognizes property rights, Waverly countered. This woman is a thief and a murderer. If you're harboring her, you're guilty of aiding a criminal. Through the window, Violet watched this deadly dance of words and wondered how long Jacob could hold them off with argument alone. The chained man, Samuel, looked toward the house with desperate eyes, and she knew he'd already told them everything he knew about her time in St. Louis. Even if this woman you're looking for was here, Jacob said slowly, even if she did take money and a child, maybe she had good reason. Maybe that child was sick and needed help that nobody else would provide. Are you questioning my judgment about my own property? Waverly's voice turned sharp with anger. I'm questioning the judgment of any man who calls a sick child property instead of a human being who deserves care and protection. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Violet could see the tension building in the set of Jacob's shoulders, the way his finger hovered near the rifle's trigger. These men hadn't come to negotiate. They'd come to take her back, dead or alive. Last chance, farmer, the slave catcher said. Hand over the woman, and we'll consider this a misunderstanding. Keep protecting her, and you'll hang alongside her. There's no woman here to hand over, Jacob replied. But there are 3 armed trespassers on my land who need to leave before something unfortunate happens. Waverly's eyes glittered with cold calculation. Search the house, he told the slave catcher. If she's here, we'll find her. You'll find nothing but trouble if you step foot in my home, Jacob said, raising his rifle to his shoulder. I fought 3 years to end slavery. I'll fight 3 more minutes to keep it ended. The slave catcher started to dismount, his hand on his gun. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, 3 armed men against 1, with Violet trapped in the house and nowhere to run. That's when she made her choice. The front door opened, and Violet stepped onto the porch. She held her head high despite the fear coursing through her veins, and her voice was clear and strong when she spoke. I'm Violet Hayes, she announced, and you gentlemen are trespassing on my husband's land. The word, husband, fell like a stone into still water, creating ripples of confusion and anger that Violet could see spreading across Waverly's face. Your husband, he sputtered. Mrs. Violet Brennan, she corrected, stepping down from the porch to stand beside Jacob. Legally married and legally free. Now get off our property before my husband decides to exercise his right to defend his home. Jacob's eyes never left the 3 riders, but she felt rather than saw his surprise at her appearance. She'd just thrown away her one chance to hide, to let them ride on thinking she wasn't there. But looking at Jacob standing alone against 3 armed men, she couldn't bear to let him face the danger by himself. A marriage of convenience, Waverly sneered. It doesn't change what you did. It changes everything, Violet replied. I'm a free woman married to a free man on free soil. Whatever happened in Missouri has no power here. The slave catcher's eyes narrowed. We'll see about that. This isn't over. As the 3 riders turned and galloped away, Violet felt Jacob's hand find hers. His palm was warm and steady, and for the first time since she'd stepped onto the porch, she allowed herself to breathe. That was either very brave or very foolish, Jacob murmured. Maybe both, Violet admitted. But I couldn't let you face them alone. Jacob squeezed her hand gently. We're in this together now. For better or worse. Watching the dust clouds disappear toward the horizon, Violet knew that Waverly and his men would be back. Next time they'd come with more men, better plans, and legal papers that might be harder to challenge. But for now, she and Jacob had stood together and held their ground. And in that moment of shared danger, their marriage of convenience had become something else entirely. A partnership built on courage, trust, and the fierce determination to protect what they'd built together. The real test was still coming. The barn erupted in flames just after midnight, orange tongues of fire licking hungrily at the wooden beams while Jacob's prize mare screamed in terror from her burning stall. Violet bolted upright in bed, her heart hammering as the acrid smell of smoke filled their bedroom and the sound of crackling which shattered the peaceful night. Fire! Jacob was already pulling on his boots, his face grim in the hellish glow that painted their walls red. Get the water buckets! But even as they raced outside, both of them knew this was no accident. The fire burned too evenly, too completely, consuming everything Jacob had worked years to build. In the dancing shadows beyond the flames, Violet caught glimpses of riders watching from the ridge, Waverly's men, making sure their message was clear. Daisy! Jacob lunged toward the barn, but the heat drove him back. His mare's terrified whinnying cut through the roar of flames like a knife through flesh. I have to get her out. Violet grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his muscles. It's too late. The whole structure's coming down. She's all I have left of before. Jacob's voice cracked with anguish. Before the war, before David died, before everything went wrong. I can't lose her too. The barn's roof collapsed with a thunderous crash, sending sparks spiraling into the star-filled sky like angry fireflies. Daisy's screaming stopped abruptly, and Jacob fell to his knees in the dirt, his face a mask of grief and rage. Violet knelt beside him, her own tears mixing with the ash that fell like snow around them. She understood that the mare represented more than just livestock. She was Jacob's last connection to happier times, to the man he'd been before loss broke him into pieces. I'm sorry, she whispered, her hand finding his shoulder. I'm so sorry. They killed her to hurt me, Jacob said, his voice hollow, because I stood up to them. Because I chose you over their twisted version of justice. Jacob! No! He stood abruptly, his blue eyes reflecting the dying flames. I won't let them terrorize us on our own land. I won't let them turn us into victims. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both turn. Henrik Johansson rode hard across the field, followed by 3 other neighbors who'd seen the fire's glow and come to help. Their faces were grim as they surveyed the destruction. Slavers? Henrik asked without preamble. Jacob nodded. Waverley's men. They want Violet back, and they're willing to burn everything to get her. Then they don't know who they're dealing with, Mrs. Patterson said, climbing down from Henrik's wagon with surprising agility for a woman her age. We didn't fight a war to end slavery just to let men like that terrorize our neighbors. This isn't your fight, Violet protested. I won't have good people hurt because of me. Child, you're one of us now, Henrik said firmly. When they attack you, they attack all of us. When they burn your barn, they threaten every farm in the valley. Over the next hour, as they worked to contain the fire's spread and save what little they could, Violet learned something she'd never expected. That community could be chosen as well as born into. These people who barely knew her were willing to risk everything to protect her, not because they had to, but because it was right. They'll be back, Jacob said as dawn broke over the smoking ruins. With more men, probably a federal marshal to make it look legal. Let them come, Henrik replied. We'll be ready. But readiness, Violet knew, might not be enough. Waverley had money, connections, and the law twisted to serve his purposes. All they had was determination and the fragile hope that justice might still mean something in this corner of the world. As the sun climbed higher, revealing the full extent of the damage, Violet made a decision that surprised even herself. She walked to the house, retrieved the small bundle of money she'd been saving, and pressed it into Jacob's hands. What's this? He asked. Enough to buy new lumber, new tools, maybe even another horse. She met his eyes steadily. I've been saving every penny you paid me for work. It's not much, but it's a start. Jacob stared at the money, then at her face. Violet, this is yours. You earned it. We earned it, she corrected. Partners, remember? And partners don't let each other face ruin alone. Something shifted in Jacob's expression. Surprise giving way to something deeper, warmer. You're not just staying because you have nowhere else to go, are you? Violet considered the question seriously. She could leave. With her savings and the skills she'd learned, she could disappear into the growing territories where no one knew her name or her history. She could start fresh somewhere Waverley would never find her. But looking at Jacob's soot-streaked face, at the neighbors who'd risked their own safety to help strangers, at the land that had become home in ways she'd never expected, she knew her answer. I'm staying because this is where I belong, she said simply. This is where we belong. Jacob's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. Then we rebuild. Together. Together, Violet agreed. But even as they began planning their recovery, even as their neighbors offered tools and labor and hope, Violet couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. Waverley wasn't the type of man to be deterred by one setback, and next time he might bring more than fire to their door. Still, standing in the ashes of their barn with Jacob's hand warm in hers and their friends gathered around them, Violet felt something she'd almost forgotten. The power of people choosing to stand together against forces that would tear them apart. Whatever came next, they wouldn't face it alone. The federal marshal's badge gleamed like a cold star in the August heat as he rode up to what remained of Jacob and Violet's farm, followed by 12 armed men who looked like they'd been handpicked for their willingness to use violence. Violet watched from the kitchen window as Jacob set down his hammer and stepped away from the half-rebuilt barn, his face calm but his hands ready. Jacob Brennan, Marshal Stevens called out, his voice carrying the authority of federal law. I have a warrant for the arrest of the woman known as Violet Hayes Brennan. Violet's blood turned to ice. After months of rebuilding, of hoping they'd found peace, the past had finally caught up with them in the worst possible way. Through the window, she could see Waverley sitting his horse behind the marshal, his smile cold and triumphant. On what charges? Jacob's voice carried clearly across the yard. Theft of property, kidnapping of a minor, and violation of the Fugitive Slave Act, Stevens replied, unfolding an official-looking document. Federal crimes that supersede any territorial protections. The Fugitive Slave Act was superseded by the 13th Amendment. Jacob shot back. Slavery is illegal. Has been for 3 years. Property crimes aren't, Waverly interjected. She stole $40 and abducted a valuable slave child. The fact that the child later died makes this a murder case as well. Violet's hands shook as she remembered Mary's fevered face, the way the little girl had clung to her in those final desperate days. She tried everything. Cooling baths, herbal remedies, prayers whispered in the darkness. But Mary had been sick for too long, neglected for too long, and love alone hadn't been enough to save her. Violet! Jacob called toward the house. Stay inside. But Violet was already moving, not toward the back door and escape, but toward the front porch and confrontation. She'd spent enough of her life running. If these men wanted her, they'd have to take her with dignity intact. I'm Violet Brennan, she announced, stepping into the bright sunlight with her head held high. And I did exactly what they're accusing me of. A collective gasp came from the mounted men. They'd expected denials, pleas, attempts to escape. What they got was a woman who looked them in the eye and claimed her choices. You admit to theft and kidnapping? Stevens asked, clearly thrown off balance. I admit to taking money to buy medicine for a dying child, Violet replied. I admit to carrying that child away from people who cared more about property values than human life. If that's theft and kidnapping, then I'm guilty. Violet, don't, Jacob started. No, she held up her hand. I'm tired of hiding from the truth. Yes, I took Mary from Waverly's plantation. She was burning with fever, and he wouldn't let me call a doctor because she was just a slave child. I stole $40 from his desk to pay for medicine. I carried her north, looking for someone who would treat her like a human being instead of livestock. And the child died, Waverly said with satisfaction, making you responsible for murder. The child died because you let her get sick in the first place. Violet's voice rose, years of suppressed anger finally breaking free. She died because you worked her mother to death and left a 6-year-old to raise herself. She died because you valued your comfort more than her life. Enough! Stevens dismounted, his hand on his gun. You're under arrest. Come peacefully, and no one else gets hurt. No one else. Jacob stepped between Stevens and Violet, his rifle now in his hands. You're threatening my wife on my land. That hurts me plenty. Stand aside, Brennan. This doesn't concern you. Everything about my wife concerns me. Jacob's voice was deadly quiet. You want her? You go through me. And me. Henrik Johansson's voice came from the ridge, where he sat his horse with 5 other armed neighbors. And me, called Mrs. Patterson from behind the well. And me, echoed Tom Bradley from beside the chicken coop. One by one, voices rose from around the farm as their neighbors revealed themselves. Men and women who'd positioned themselves strategically while the federal men had focused on the main confrontation. Stevens found himself surrounded by a dozen armed civilians who clearly had no intention of backing down. This is federal business, Stevens shouted. You're all interfering with the law. Whose law? Henrik asked mildly. The law that says all men are created equal? The law that says slavery is illegal? Or the law that says rich men can buy whatever justice they want? The law that says criminals must face consequences, Stevens replied, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. Then arrest Waverly, Violet said clearly. He's the one who let a child die of neglect. He's the one who treated human beings like farm animals. He's the one who's trying to use federal authority to settle a personal grudge. Stevens looked around at the circle of determined faces, calculating odds and political consequences. A federal marshal shooting civilians to arrest a black woman in Dakota Territory. It would be a scandal that could end careers and topple administrations. You're making a mistake, he said finally. All of you. The only mistake, Jacob said, would be letting you take my wife. For a long moment, violence hung in the air like heat lightning. Then Stephen slowly remounted his horse, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "This isn't over," he said. "I'll be back with more men, with federal troops if necessary." "You do that," Henrik called out. "But next time, bring better reasons than an old slaver's hurt feelings." As the federal men rode away, Violet felt Jacob's arm slip around her waist. She was shaking with fear, with relief, with the overwhelming realization that these people she'd barely known a year ago had been willing to risk everything to protect her. "Why?" she whispered to the gathered neighbors. "Why would you do this for me?" "Because you're one of us," Mrs. Patterson said simply. "Because what's right is right, regardless of what some piece of paper says. Because," Henrik added with a grin, "slavers burned down our neighbor's barn. That makes it personal." As their friends began to disperse, promising to keep watch and stay ready, Jacob turned to Violet with an expression she'd never seen before. Pride mixed with something that might have been love. "That was the bravest thing I've ever seen," he said quietly. "Or the most foolish. Maybe both." Jacob's smile was warm despite the danger still hanging over them. "But I'd rather face the world with a brave fool than hide from it with a wise coward." Looking around at their half-rebuilt farm, at the neighbors who'd become family, at the man who'd chosen to stand with her against impossible odds, Violet felt something she'd never expected to feel again. Hope for a future where love might be stronger than law, where community might be more powerful than authority, where two damaged people might actually build something beautiful together. But first, they had to survive what was coming next. Blood dripped steadily from Jacob's split lip onto the dusty floor of Waverly's makeshift camp as the slavers prepared for what they called frontier justice. A hanging tree and a kangaroo court designed to end the problem of Violet Brennan once and for all. 3 days had passed since armed men had taken Jacob during his morning ride to check the cattle, and now Violet crouched in the tall grass 50 yards away, watching the men who planned to murder her husband. 12 of them, Henrik whispered beside her, his weathered face grim as he counted the armed figures around the campfire. Too many for a straight fight. Violet's heart hammered against her ribs as she studied the scene through the gathering dusk. Jacob sat tied to a wooden post near the center of camp, his shirt torn and his face bearing the marks of several beatings. But his eyes were alert, scanning the perimeter, and she knew he was looking for escape routes even as Waverly paced before him like a predator savoring its kill. "We don't need a straight fight," she murmured back. "We need to be smarter than they are." The plan they'd hatched was desperate and dangerous. Mrs. Patterson would create a distraction by driving a wagon loaded with hay toward the camp's east side, while Tom Bradley and 2 other neighbors positioned themselves with rifles on the rocky outcrop to the north. Meanwhile, Violet and Henrik would circle around to free Jacob during the confusion. "You sure about this?" Henrik asked for the 3rd time. "If we're caught, they'll hang all of us." "They're planning to hang Jacob anyway," Violet replied. "At least this way we fight back." Through the camp, she could hear Waverly's voice carrying on the night wind as he addressed his men. "Tomorrow morning we'll hold a proper trial. Evidence will be presented, witnesses will testify, and justice will be served. By noon, this problem will be solved permanently." "What about the woman?" one of the men called out. "She'll come to us," Waverly said with cold confidence. "Love makes people do foolish things. When she sees her husband swinging from that oak tree, she'll either surrender or do something stupid that gets her killed. Either way, my property will be recovered or avenged." Violet's hands tightened on her rifle. Waverly understood love as weakness, loyalty as foolishness. He couldn't imagine that these very qualities might be what destroyed him. The first part of their plan unfolded exactly as hoped. Mrs. Patterson's wagon appeared on the eastern horizon just as full darkness fell, moving fast and trailing sparks from the hay that had been deliberately set smoldering. The slavers assumed it was an accident, a runaway wagon with cargo catching fire, and 6 men rode out to investigate or loot whatever they could find. "Now," Henrik breathed. They moved like shadows through the tall grass, using every depression and bush for cover. Violet's heart pounded so hard she was sure it could be heard across the camp, but years of fear had taught her to move silently when her life depended on it. Jacob saw them coming. She caught the almost imperceptible nod he gave when he spotted their approach, and she knew he was ready. His bonds had been loosened by hours of working at them, and when Henrik's knife cut through the remaining rope, Jacob was on his feet instantly. "Go!" he whispered urgently. "Henrik, get Violet out of here." "We all go together," Violet hissed back. "That's the plan." But plans, as they discovered, rarely survive contact with reality. One of the remaining guards chose that moment to walk around the post where Jacob had been tied, and his shout of alarm split the night like breaking glass. "They're here. The prisoners are escaping." Gunfire erupted from multiple directions as Waverly's men returned fire at Tom Bradley's position while trying to recapture their escaped prisoner. In the chaos of muzzle flashes and shouting voices, Violet lost sight of both Jacob and Henrik. "This way." Jacob's voice came from her left, and she followed the sound through the darkness, stumbling over unseen rocks and dodging bullets that whistled past her head like angry wasps. They ran through the night, guided by stars and desperation, until their legs gave out beside a creek 2 miles from Waverly's camp. Only then did Violet realize that Henrik wasn't with them. "Where is he?" she gasped, scanning the darkness. "Jacob, where's Henrik?" Jacob's face was pale in the moonlight. "He stayed behind. Told me to get you to safety while he held them off." "No." Violet started to rise. "We have to go back for him." "Violet." Jacob's hands gripped her shoulders. "He made his choice. He bought us time with his life, and if we waste it, his sacrifice means nothing." The sound of distant gunfire had stopped, leaving only the whisper of wind through grass and the gentle burble of the creek. Somewhere behind them, brave Henrik Johansson was either dead or captured, and Violet felt the weight of his sacrifice like a stone in her chest. "This is my fault," she whispered. "All of it. If I hadn't come to your farm, if I hadn't brought my troubles to your door." "Stop." Jacob's voice was firm but gentle. "You didn't ask for any of this. You didn't choose to be born into slavery, to lose the child you loved, to be hunted like an animal for showing mercy. This is Waverly's doing, not yours." They held each other beside the creek as dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. Around them, the Dakota Territory awakened to another day of endless possibility, but all Violet could think about was the friends who'd risked everything to save her and the man who'd paid the ultimate price for her freedom. "What do we do now?" she asked. Jacob was quiet for a long moment, staring at the water flowing past their feet. When he spoke, his voice carried a resolution that surprised her. "We go home," he said. "We rebuild what they destroyed. We live the life Henrik died to protect." He turned to meet her eyes. "And we make sure his sacrifice wasn't for nothing. Waverly won't stop. He'll keep coming until one of us is dead. Then we'll be ready for him." Jacob's jaw was set with grim determination. "But we won't run anymore. We won't hide. We'll stand our ground and trust that right makes might, not the other way around." As they began the long walk home, Violet found herself thinking about the child growing inside her. Jacob's child, conceived during the quiet moments between battles, nurtured by hope despite the violence surrounding them. This baby would be born into a world where love was dangerous and justice was rare, but also into a community willing to fight for both. Henrik's courage would live on in the stories they told their children. His sacrifice would mean something because they refused to let fear win. Behind them, smoke rose from Waverly's camp, and Violet knew their final confrontation was still coming. But ahead lay home, friends, and the stubborn hope that tomorrow might be better than today. The morning sun painted Violet's growing belly in golden light as she sat on the porch steps, her hands resting protectively over the child that had become both her greatest joy and deepest fear. For months pregnant and still fighting for her freedom, she watched Jacob repair the fence that Waverly's men had destroyed during their latest raid. His movements careful and deliberate despite the exhaustion that marked his features. "You should be resting," he called over, setting down his hammer to wipe sweat from his forehead. "I've been resting for hours," Violet replied, though they both knew rest had become a luxury neither could afford. "Besides, someone needs to keep watch." The attacks had grown bolder and more frequent since Henrik's death 6 weeks ago. Waverley had abandoned any pretense of legal authority and now operated like a warlord, striking fast and disappearing before neighbors could organize a response. Crops had been poisoned, livestock stolen, and just last week they'd found a threatening message nailed to their door. The child you carry will be born a slave if it's born at all. Jacob. Violet's voice carried a note of concern that made him look up immediately. There's something I need to tell you about the baby. He set down his tools and crossed to sit beside her on the steps, his calloused hand finding hers. What is it? Are you feeling sick again? No, it's not that. Violet took a deep breath, gathering courage for words she'd been rehearsing for days. I've been thinking about what happens if Waverley succeeds. If something happens to me before the baby comes. Nothing will happen to you, Jacob said fiercely. I won't let it. You can't promise that. Violet's voice was gentle but firm. We both know how dangerous this has become. And if the worst happens, I need to know you'll protect our child. Jacob's grip on her hand tightened. Of course I will. That's not even a question. I mean really protect her. Not just from Waverley, but from the world that says she's less than human because of the color of her skin. Violet's eyes met his directly. This baby will be mixed race, Jacob. Half black, half white, and fully hated by people who think love like ours shouldn't exist. The weight of her words settled between them like stones. In their quiet moments of happiness, it had been easy to forget that their child would face challenges neither of them had fully considered. A mixed-race baby in 1868 would belong fully to neither world, accepted completely by neither community. Then we'll teach her that their hatred says nothing about her worth and everything about their blindness, Jacob said quietly. We'll raise her to be strong enough to face whatever comes. We. Violet's voice caught on the word. Jacob, you don't understand. If something happens to me, you could walk away. Find a white woman, start over clean. No one would blame you for. Stop. Jacob's voice was sharp enough to cut. Just stop right there. He stood and began pacing the small porch, his hands running through his hair in the gesture Violet had learned meant he was struggling with emotions too big for words. You think I'd abandon our child? He asked finally. You think I'd pretend she never existed just to make my life easier? I think you're a good man who might not understand what you're signing up for, Violet replied honestly. Raising a mixed child alone, dealing with the stares and whispers and outright hostility. I understand plenty. Jacob's voice was quiet but fierce. I understand that this baby is half you and half me, which makes her the most precious thing in the world. I understand that anyone who has a problem with her parentage can go straight to hell. Violet felt tears prick her eyes. Even if people turn against you, even if you lose friends, opportunities, respect. I lost my respect for most people the day they decided some humans were worth more than others. Jacob sat back down beside her, his arm sliding around her shoulders. And any friend who'd abandon me for loving you and protecting our child wasn't much of a friend to begin with. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the morning light creep across their small farm. In the distance, cattle grazed peacefully, and the rebuilt barn stood as testament to their determination to keep building despite those who would tear everything down. I have something for you, Jacob said suddenly, reaching into his shirt pocket. I've been waiting for the right moment. He pulled out a small wooden figure, a woman holding a baby, carved with the same careful attention to detail that marked all his work. The woman's face was serene despite the protective way she cradled her child, and Violet could see herself in the carved features. It's beautiful, she whispered, turning the figure over in her hands. When did you make this? Nights when you were sleeping, when I was too worried to rest myself. Jacob's voice was soft. I wanted you to have something that showed how I see you, not as someone I'm protecting out of duty, but as the strongest person I've ever known. I don't feel strong, Violet admitted. Most days I feel terrified. Being scared doesn't make you weak. Doing what's right despite being scared, that's what makes you strong. Jacob's hand covered hers on the wooden figure. Our daughter is going to have the strongest mother in the territory. Our daughter. Violet raised an eyebrow. What makes you so sure it's a girl? Jacob's smile was the first genuinely happy expression she'd seen on his face in weeks. Just a feeling. Call it father's intuition. A sound from the road made them both look up, riders approaching, but these moved slowly and carried a white flag. As they drew closer, Violet recognized Marshal Stevens accompanied by two men she didn't know. "Stay behind me," Jacob murmured, rising and reaching for his rifle. "Mr. and Mrs. Brennan," Stevens called out when he was close enough to be heard without shouting. "I'd like to talk, if you're willing to listen." "Talk about what?" Jacob replied, his weapon held ready but not aimed. "About ending this before more people die." Stevens dismounted but kept his hands visible. "About finding a solution that doesn't involve bloodshed." Violet stood slowly, her hand still clutching the wooden figure Jacob had given her. After months of running and fighting and watching friends sacrifice themselves for her freedom, the possibility of peace seemed almost too good to believe. But looking at the marshal's face, she saw something she hadn't expected: doubt, maybe even regret. Whatever Stevens had come to propose, it wasn't what anyone would expect. "We're listening," she said, stepping up beside Jacob. "But we're not surrendering." "I'm not here to arrest anyone," Stevens replied. "I'm here to offer you a choice that might save all our lives." The morning suddenly felt full of possibility and danger in equal measure. Whatever Stevens was about to propose would change everything, but whether for better or worse remained to be seen. "Waverly's dead." The three words hit Jacob and Violet like lightning strikes, changing everything they thought they knew about their situation in the span of a heartbeat. Marshal Stevens stood in their yard with his hat in his hands and an expression that mixed relief with something darker. The look of a man who'd seen justice served in ways that wouldn't appear in any official report. "What happened?" Jacob asked, his rifle lowering slightly but not disappearing entirely. "Heart attack officially." Stevens glanced around the farm as if checking for listeners. "Happened 3 nights ago in his camp. 1 minute he was ranting about property rights and federal authority. The next he was clutching his chest and falling over dead." Violet felt her knees go weak. Months of terror, of running and hiding and fighting for her life, and it had ended with something as simple and natural as a man's heart giving out. "You're certain he's dead?" "Buried him myself yesterday." Stevens pulled a folded paper from his jacket. "Which brings me to why I'm here. Seems Mr. Waverly had some interesting documents in his possession when he passed." The paper he handed to Jacob was yellowed with age and bore an official seal that Violet didn't recognize. As Jacob read, his eyebrows climbed toward his hairline and his grip on the document tightened. "What is it?" Violet asked. "Manumission papers," Jacob said slowly. "Legal documents freeing a slave named Mary Collins and her caretaker, Violet Hayes." He looked up at Stevens. "These are dated 6 months before Mary died." Stevens nodded grimly. "Turns out Waverly's wife had a change of heart before she passed 2 years ago. She freed both you and the child, but Waverly buried the papers and never filed them with the proper authorities. As far as the law was concerned, you were both free when you left his plantation." The world seemed to tilt around Violet as the implications sank in. Everything she'd believed about herself, about her legal status, about the crimes she'd supposedly committed, all of it had been a lie built on hidden documents and a dead woman's mercy. "So I was never a runaway slave," she whispered. "You were a free woman taking care of a free child," Stevens confirmed. "Which means everything Waverly did to you, the hunting, the threats, the violence, was completely illegal. He was the criminal, not you." Jacob's arm slipped around Violet's waist as she struggled to process this revelation. Why didn't his wife file the papers herself? Because she died before she could complete the process. Her husband found them among her effects and decided to pretend they didn't exist rather than lose valuable property. Stevens's voice carried disgust. "Man was willing to commit kidnapping and murder to protect a lie." "What about the money I took?" Violet asked. "The $40? Payment for services rendered," Stevens said with a slight smile. "Free woman working for wages has every right to her earnings. Turns out Mrs. Waverly's diary mentions several payments she intended to make to you for Mary's care. The relief that flooded through Violet was so intense it left her dizzy. For over a year, she'd carried the weight of believing herself a thief and kidnapper, a woman whose love had led to crime. Now she discovered that her actions had been not just morally right but legally justified. "There's more," Stevens continued. "Waverly's estate includes a substantial amount of money that legally belongs to freed slaves he never compensated for their work. Since you're the only surviving beneficiary we can locate, you're entitled to a considerable sum." "How considerable?" Jacob asked. "Enough to buy 10 farms this size," Stevens replied. "Enough to set up a trust fund for your children's education. Enough to live comfortably for the rest of your lives." Violet stared at the marshal, certain she'd misheard. "You're saying I'm wealthy?" "I'm saying justice sometimes comes with interest," Stevens said. "The money can't undo the suffering Waverly caused, but it can ensure you never have to fear poverty or powerlessness again." As the magnitude of their changed circumstances settled over them, Violet found herself thinking not about luxury or security, but about the friends who'd risked everything to protect her. Henrik, who'd died believing he was saving a fugitive slave. Mrs. Patterson, who'd faced down federal marshals for a woman she barely knew. Tom Bradley and the others who'd stood with rifles ready to defend her freedom. "Henrik should be here for this," she said quietly. "Henrik died for this," Jacob corrected gently. "He died believing in your right to be free, to be safe, to be treated with dignity. The fact that you were already legally free doesn't diminish his sacrifice. It proves he was right all along." Stevens cleared his throat. "There's one more thing. Waverly's men scattered after his death, but some of them were caught by federal troops. They've been talking, trying to avoid charges. Seems this wasn't the first time Waverly used false claims to hunt down freed slaves who'd left his plantation." "You mean there were others?" Violet felt sick at the thought. "At least a dozen that we know of. Families torn apart, people killed or returned to slavery based on fabricated charges." Stevens's face was hard. "Your case is helping us build charges against the whole network. Your courage in fighting back is going to save other lives." The irony wasn't lost on Violet. In fleeing what she thought was justice, she'd helped expose a system of injustice that had destroyed countless lives. Her survival had become a weapon against the very forces that had tried to destroy her. "What happens now?" Jacob asked. "Now you get to live," Stevens said simply. "No more looking over your shoulders, no more wondering when the next attack will come. You're free, you're wealthy, and you're under federal protection if anyone tries to challenge that freedom." As Stevens prepared to leave, he paused and looked back at them. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry. I came here ready to arrest an innocent woman based on a criminal's lies. You showed more courage and integrity than I did, and I won't forget that lesson." After the marshal rode away, Jacob and Violet sat on their porch steps in stunned silence, watching the sun climb higher in a sky that suddenly seemed full of limitless possibility. "What do we do with all that money?" Violet asked eventually. Jacob's hand found hers, his fingers intertwining with hers in the gesture that had become second nature to them both. "We build something beautiful," he said. "A school maybe, where children of all colors can learn together. A place where Henrik's grandchildren can grow up free." "Henrik's grandchildren?" "The ones Mrs. Johansson is carrying," Jacob said with a smile. "She told me yesterday. Seems Henrik left her with more than just memories." Violet felt tears of joy and sorrow mixing on her cheeks. Life and death, endings and beginnings, justice delayed but not denied. It all swirled together in her heart like threads being woven into something larger than any individual story. "Our baby will grow up free," she whispered, her hand moving to her growing belly. "Our baby will grow up rich," Jacob added with a grin. "Rich in money, rich in love, rich in the knowledge that her parents fought for what was right and won." As they sat holding each other in the morning light, Violet realized that her greatest treasure wasn't the money or the freedom or even the safety. It was the man beside her who'd chosen love over fear, who'd risked everything for a woman he barely knew and found his own salvation in the process. The weight of mercy, she understood now, wasn't just about carrying the burden of others' pain. It was about discovering that love shared made everyone stronger, that justice delayed wasn't justice denied, and that sometimes the very thing you're running from turns out to be the path that leads you home. The first cry of baby Hope Catherine Brennan pierced the winter morning like a song of victory, announcing to the Dakota Territory that love had triumphed over every force that tried to destroy it. Violet held her daughter against her chest, marveling at the perfect tiny fingers, the shock of dark hair, and the eyes that seemed to hold wisdom far beyond her minutes of life. "She's beautiful," Jacob whispered, his voice thick with emotion as he touched the baby's impossibly soft cheek. "She's absolutely perfect." "She looks like you," Violet murmured, studying the delicate features that somehow blended the best of both parents. "But she has my stubborn chin." Dr. Morrison, no relation to the preacher, but a traveling physician who'd arrived just in time for the birth, packed his instruments with practiced efficiency. "Healthy baby, healthy mother, and the proudest father I've seen in 20 years of delivering babies. You folks have been blessed." Outside, snow fell gently on the prosperous farm that had risen from the ashes of their struggles. The new barn was twice the size of the old one. The house had been expanded with rooms for the growing family they planned, and the pastures held cattle that bore the Brennan brand with pride. But the real wealth lay in the relationships they'd built. Mrs. Patterson had appointed herself unofficial grandmother and could be found most mornings helping with breakfast and dispensing advice whether asked for or not. Tom Bradley and his family had become like siblings, sharing tools and meals and the comfortable familiarity of people who'd faced danger together and survived. "Has anyone told Mrs. Johansson?" Violet asked as Jacob settled into the chair beside her bed. "She's on her way," he replied. "Along with half the valley, I suspect. News travels fast when there's something worth celebrating." Henrik's widow had indeed been pregnant when her husband died, and baby Eric Johansson had been born 3 months ago, a living reminder that hope could grow even in the soil of grief. The two babies would grow up together, their father's friendship carrying forward into a new generation. "Jacob," Violet said softly, studying her husband's face in the lamplight, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't knocked on your door that first day?" He considered the question seriously, his fingers gently stroking Hope's tiny hand. "I think I would have died," he said finally. "Not all at once, but slowly, day by day, until there was nothing left but an empty shell going through the motions of living. And I think I would have frozen to death in some ditch before winter ended," Violet replied. "Two broken people who saved each other by accident." "Not accident," Jacob corrected. "Providence. Someone up there knew we needed each other, even when we didn't know it ourselves." The sound of multiple horses approaching made them both look toward the window. Their friends had indeed come to celebrate. Mrs. Patterson's wagon led a small parade of neighbors bearing gifts and good wishes for the newest member of their community. "Ready to introduce our daughter to the world?" Jacob asked. Violet looked down at Hope's peaceful face, then around the warm room that had become home in ways she'd never thought possible. The journey that had brought her here, from slavery to freedom, from desperation to love, from running to standing still, seemed like a story told about someone else's life. "More than ready," she said, as their friends filled the house with laughter and congratulations, as Mrs. Patterson cooed over the baby and Tom Bradley slapped Jacob on the back and declared him the luckiest man in the territory. Violet felt a deep peace settle over her heart. Hope would grow up in a world still marked by prejudice and hatred, but she would face those challenges from a position of strength. She would know she was loved unconditionally, valued completely, and supported by a community that had chosen her family despite the color of their skin. "What do you think she'll be when she grows up?" Mrs. Patterson asked, holding Hope with the confidence of someone who'd helped raise half the children in the valley. "Free," Violet said without hesitation. "Whatever else she becomes, she'll be free to choose her own path." "She'll be strong," Jacob added. "With parents like these, how could she be anything else?" "She'll be loved," Mrs. Johansson said softly, baby Eric sleeping peacefully in her arms. "And she'll never doubt that she belongs exactly where she is." As evening fell and their friends gradually departed, Jacob and Violet found themselves alone with their daughter for the first time. The house felt different now, Not just a shelter from the storm, but a home where a family would grow and thrive. I used to think mercy was about carrying other people's pain, Violet said as she nursed Hope by the firelight. But I understand now that it's about something bigger. It's about choosing love even when love seems impossible. It's about believing that broken things can be made whole. You made me whole, Jacob said simply. You and Hope both. I was just pieces of a man when you found me, but you showed me how to put myself back together. We did that for each other, Violet corrected. We chose to build something beautiful instead of staying broken. Outside, the winter wind sang through the eaves, but inside their home, warmth and love and hope made their own music. Hope Catherine Brennan slept peacefully in her mother's arms, dreaming whatever dreams newborns dream, surrounded by the absolute certainty that she was wanted, cherished, and protected. The weight of mercy, they had learned, wasn't a burden to be carried alone. When shared between people who chose to love despite every reason not to, it became the foundation on which new worlds could be built. Worlds where the color of skin mattered less than the content of character, where love conquered fear, and where even the most broken hearts could find their way home. In the flickering firelight, 3 generations of love rested peacefully. The memory of those who had sacrificed for freedom, the reality of those who had fought for it, and the promise of those who would inherit it. Hope Catherine Brennan would never know slavery, would never understand what it meant to be considered property, would never doubt her right to love and be loved. And in that certainty, Jacob and Violet found their greatest victory.